So
Yes, ma'am. We have shared it on our class groups and or in our previous undergraduate college courses. So mostly students, and Rohit sir has also shared it with other professors. So we are hoping that some of the professors from the department also join in.
Okay. So my connection tends to get a bit wobbly after about 45 minutes, 1 hour. So let's see how long it lasts. Maybe I should get out of the video because that saves the data a bit, right? And I'll rejoin with the video once you do the introduction. So I'm stopping the video now.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect, ma'am. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
The idea who these people are, still no idea.
Mainly students, economic students in JNU.
Our center students.
Plus other centers, I think.
But
possibly
by our center students. But you should find out because you don't know who they are.
I think, yeah. So Prabhat wants to know who you are. Are you CSP students or students also
Yes,
from other centers? You're mainly CSP students?
Ma'am, our team is currently, most of us are from the Center for Economic Studies and Planning.
Right,
which,
right.
Yes, ma'am. And we're an online batch and we are in our second year master's program.
Mm-hmm. So what about other centers in JNU, like, international trade and developments and so on? Do they also sometimes join in the talks?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Definitely. Yes, ma'am. And we're also collaborating with other departments for our future, like the juniors who have come in. So we are collaborating with them as well, with the other centers. So it's open to everyone thinking economics.
Right.
Ma'am, and for the talk, like everyone across the centers and also associated with the Rethinking Economics Global Network, everyone gets to know about this. So many people, even from outside JNU, joins.
Okay. And for how long do you have the Zoom lasting for? Just 1 hour from the time you begin?
Ma'am, it is open till 7 p.m.
Till when? Sorry?
Till 7 p.m.
Oh.
Yes, ma'am.
Because you said only 1 hour, 45 minutes for talking and 15 for...
Yes, ma'am. We've just kept that window for the technical issues. Otherwise, we've scheduled it for an hour only.
You scheduled it till 7 p.m. I mean, it will be available to you, this particular platform.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. Because then, I thought 45 minutes, I would really have to rush. I can take 3 or 4 minutes extra in that case, right?
Yes, ma'am, no problem at all. You can take as much as you want. I mean, we have the window till 7.
I can't take as much as I want, I'm sure, but I just wanted to know if it's a very tight schedule or not, or whether there's some flexibility. Okay, so you're saying there is some flexibility in the schedule.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good.
Should we begin this session? We have about 69 participants as of now, and some more people are joining in. But I think we should start the session right now. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Today we have with us, it's a proud privilege to have Professor Utsa Patnaik with us, who has been a professor at Center for Economic Planning and Studies in Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And she'll be talking about imperialism and the present state of capitalism for today's talk. And her book recently came out, which was Capital and Imperialism, Theory, History, and the Present, which we're all very excited to read. And ma'am, it is our proud privilege and honor to have you here. And I do not think that you really need a longer introduction, as we all have cited you in our term papers. So, and to the audience, please feel free to put any questions that you have in the question answer section, and the session will be recorded. So just informing you on that note so that you can access it later. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm happy to be talking to students of JNU after a long, long time. But the particular topic that you've announced is not one which I was asked to choose. It's something that you chose. And let me at the outset say that it's far too big a topic to be dealt with in just 45 to 50 minutes. So I will be speaking mainly about some aspects of our book published earlier this year, Capital and Imperialism. That is the book I have published jointly with Prabhat Patnaik. And again, that book also covers a very large range of issues. So I will take up only a few of those issues. In particular, I will not talk at all really about the first part of the book, which is concerned with the whole question of the value of money and the importance of the value of money being kept stable in a money-using economy. Now, all economies, of course, are money-using, but the capitalist economy in particular simply cannot function without money. It pervades every aspect of economic activity. And for the argument there, which says essentially that as long as money is not merely used for transaction purposes, which is the case, in fact, in a capitalist economy, it is not used only for transaction purposes, but also as a means of holding wealth, then keeping the value of money stable becomes extremely important for the smooth running of the capitalist system, and particularly the smooth running of the economy of the world capitalist leader, which currently is the United States. In the past, it was Great Britain before the war. And at the same time, there is an exposition of what we understand to be Marx's theory of money, which is essentially, we say, a commodity theory of money. That is, the value of money depends crucially on the commodities that it can command. And the countries which are in the global north today, which colonized the global south in the past, in fact, do not have command over a very large range of commodities, which are essential both for their production and for sustaining the consumption level of their populations. Now, as far as production is concerned, the importance of oil is obvious. There's been so much written about oil imperialism. I would just like to remind you about the latest estimates. I see a full screen of Labisha. Can you put me on the screen, Labisha, rather than yourself? I don't see me. I see me only in a corner. Okay?
I'm on our screen. It's you on the screen.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, well, while you're sorting that out, how to do that, let me just continue to say that the latest estimates regarding oil are that today's industrial north, the countries in the industrial north, have access to only 11% of the known fossil fuel reserves in the world, only 11%, within their territorial boundaries. Of course, there may be, we don't have very firm estimates of oil, which is fossil fuels, which are available below water. But if you think of the territorial limits of the northern countries, they have only 11%. So it's not very surprising that we see oil economics expressing itself in the form of aggression against the countries which are oil producing, some of the countries which are oil producing in recent years. And we have also seen in recent years a return to agriculture as a source of energy, so-called green energy, crops being converted into ethanol once more, when that aggression has proved largely abortive in not ensuring a stable supply of oil to the industrial north, which is of course very, very heavily dependent on fossil fuels for carrying on their economic activities. So that is not an aspect I'll be talking about at all. We thought, because it has been discussed already in The Value of Money, and I would ask those of you who have not read it to read Prabhat Patnaik's book, The Value of Money, which deals with this whole oil question and talks about the oil-dollar exchange rate and so on, which was published some years ago from Columbia University Press. So in this book, in Capital and Imperialism, we are concentrating much more on aspects of the command over commodities that the global north requires, which it can only get from the global south, and which have not been at all discussed in the literature emanating from the universities of the global north. And that is primary products. Because this is something which is an issue on which you will find no mention at all in the standard literature on imperialism. And incidentally, there is a very large literature on imperialism, of course, including by scholars writing from northern universities. But I think the way in which our treatment is different from theirs is that for them, imperialism exists, but it is something which is an add-on to capitalism. In other words, they do not think of imperialism as being an integral part of capitalist accumulation. They do not think that without imperialism, the capitalist north would cease to function. That is not their thinking at all. They recognize the existence of imperialism, but it is by the way. It is not an integral part in their thinking of the working of the the capitalist economies of the industrial north. Now, our approach is exactly the opposite. Our argument in this book is, if we look historically at the origins of industrial capitalism, and here, when I use the term industrial capitalism, I'm consciously demarcating it from merchant capitalism, because merchant capital, has existed for many, many centuries in many countries and civilizations of the world without their engaging in any kind of violent external expansionism vis-a-vis each other. But the rise of industrial capitalism, which of course starts with trade and mercantilism to begin with, but its rise has been historically predicated on the violent external expansion of a handful of maritime European countries, starting with Portugal, Spain, France, Netherlands, and Britain. And these were joined much later on towards the second half of the 19th century by the late industrializers, that is Germany, Japan, Belgium, and Russia. So this kind of violent external expansionism, which resulted in two kinds of colonization, the colonies of settlement and the colonies of conquest, is something which was unprecedented. And that is what has shaped the contours of the modern world. Now, this distinction between colonies of conquest and colonies of settlement is very important, because we have the colonies of settlement where the Europeans emigrated and settled in large numbers. And the obvious, of course, areas in which they did so is North America, present-day United States of America and Canada, South Africa, Australia and New Zealand, and to some extent, Argentina also. So these were not empty lands. They were populated, though unlike Central America, North America was relatively more sparsely populated. But the European immigrants massacred most of the population, drove the rest into reservations, and they occupied the enormous land resources of these regions, and where they emigrated in very large numbers. Britain was the first immigrant economy, of course. And if we look at the data for Britain, we find that from 1820 for the next 95 years, something like half the increment to population emigrated every year to settle these lands. And about 40% of the total emigration initially was from Britain alone. And later on, Britain was followed by other European countries, and even later on by the East European immigration. But actually, when I talk about Britain, I'm not including here Irish immigration after its famines of the mid-19th century. So Britain alone had a population of around 12 million, excluding Ireland completely, in 1821. And over the almost 100 years, 16 million people emigrated from Britain to settle new areas. In other words, a larger population immigrated than was the initial entire population of the British Isles. If that kind of immigration had taken place in India, I made a calculation that since independence, more than 400 million Indians should have immigrated by now permanently to other areas, which of course is not the case, because the industrial economies closed their lands to further immigration, particularly from the global south. It is very, very tightly controlled. And at present, the Indian diaspora outside India amounts to less than 20 million persons, certainly not 400 million people. So what explains, we try to address the question in our book, what explains this massive and violent external expansionism? And of course, this was also accompanied by the institution of slavery. 1,000 years after the slavery of the ancient world, the slavery of ancient Rome and Greece, you have the institution of slavery being again coming up, with the Europeans kidnapping West Africans and converting them into slaves, carrying them across the Atlantic to work the plantations of the Central America, South America, and also North America. So the revival of slavery after a period of 1,000 years went hand in hand with the rise of industrial capitalism. And this is again a theoretical question which has not been sufficiently addressed in the literature. It's simply taken for granted. And capitalism is usually associated with free wage labor. But the point is that there was freedom of labor, freedom in the dual sense that Marx talks about, in the sense that peasants were freed from ownership of their means of production, became completely propertyless. And at the same time, they were not the property of anybody else, unlike a slave being a property of a master. So there was a process of increasing freedom of labor. But this took place only within the European countries, within the capitalist core. But this went hand in hand with the imposition of bondage and slavery on non-European peoples. They were two sides of the same coin. So the dialectical interaction between the two, of greater freedom of labor in the capitalist core industrializing country, and the imposition of forms of slavery and later indentured labor on peasant populations and village communities, which up to that point had been free. They were not slaves. They were subjected to enslavement. So why did these two things go together? We don't address this question. Again, as I said, this would take us beyond the, you would read several books, not one, to address all the questions which are raised by the actual historical process of capitalist industrialization. But what we are arguing here, taking India as the specific example, because India is the country which was colonized by the first industrial nation, Britain. And India is the country on which we have enormous amounts of data. We also have a literature on the drain of wealth, which goes back more than 100 years to Dadabhai Nauroji and Ramesh Chandra Dutt. So we have much more data on India than on any other colonized country of the global South. So focusing on India, what we are arguing here is that it is difficult to even imagine the industrial revolution taking place at all in the first industrial nation in Britain if it did not have access to colonial transfers from its tropical colonies and from India in particular, which was the largest tropical colony. And not only that, Britain became the world's largest capital exporter. So the diffusion of capitalism took place to the regions of European settlement, first British settlement, followed by European settlement in North America, that is in US, in Canada, in Australia, and South Africa, on the basis of Britain's capital exports. But it was a very small country. How did it manage to export so much capital? So in this book, we set out the mechanism of transfer from the tropical world, taking India as the prime example. But this still has to be worked out for other Asian countries, because a similar process, we think, was operating in the case of the Netherlands, which conquered Java. There were huge transfers from Java to the Netherlands. In the case of France, which colonized Indochina. And of course, the French also had possessions in the Caribbean, the French West Indies. So in the case of these countries, colonized Indonesia or Indochina, to my knowledge, nobody has really looked at the transfer mechanism in any kind of detail. In fact, there is an enormous area of work which has opened up, which needs to be done. Now, coming back to India, why was it necessary for these European countries, this handful of European countries, to engage in conquest at all? Why could they not trade normally with the countries which they actually militarily and navally subjugated and where they established their rule? Well, the reason they wanted the trade at all, and in fact, the European countries, if you look at their history, fought bitterly with each other to gain control over trade routes to the tropical world. And once they had gained control over a particular region of the tropical world, they cordoned it off from their other European rivals. They created a monopoly area for themselves. And they said, you can't come in here. Now, the reason they wanted this, we argue, is the extremely poor primary resource endowment of the cold temperate regions where most of the European countries are located. And of course, where the current world capitalist leader, the US, is also located. And this is what is never discussed in the literature. You see, the cold temperate regions had only one cropping season in the year. They could only grow one crop. And remember, agriculture was a source, and the primary sector is called primary because it's a source of everything. It is the source of your food, your fibers for clothing, is the source of the energy for transport, because remember, in the pre-fossil fuels age, which lasted really more or less up to the mid-19th century, the main energy source was agriculture for providing feed grains. In fact, what we call food grains today also doubled as feed grains for animals. And it was animal power which was used for plowing, it was used for transport, it was used even in coal mines initially in England for hauling up coal. It was used for towing barges along the rivers. So animals had to be fed out of agriculture just as human populations had to be fed. And of course, agriculture also had to provide the fibers, which were the raw materials for the Industrial Revolution in England. It had to provide the minerals, which we don't deal with in our book at all, but I've already talked about the concentration of the fossil fuels in areas outside the industrial north. So agriculture was all important, and Europe was extremely poorly endowed. Even the warm temperate areas of Europe, the countries which border the Mediterranean Sea, can grow only one crop a year, though they are somewhat better off in that they at least have the gift of the vine and the olive. But the whole of cold temperate Europe, the whole of North America, the land is frozen for half the year. Not a single blade of grass can grow. There's only one cropping season. So that cropping season had to produce the grain which had to feed not only human populations, but also the animal populations, which were maintained not only for food, but also for transport, for plowing, and so on. And productivity was extremely low. I pointed out that if you look at the literature on late medieval European agriculture, there were even rare cases, but they existed. When crops failed in successive years in Europe, then there were actually cases of community cannibalism. When people had no food, they were driven to desperation. Now, this is a well-hidden secret. The Europeans don't talk about it. But of course, it was very rare, but it did occur. It is there in the chronicles, and it is mentioned in the books which deal with the agrarian history of Western Europe. The consumption level was extremely poor, very monotonous. Food produced during the single growing season had to be preserved through the winter months. And because nothing fresh could be grown at all, it was heavily dependent on meat and animal fats. Diseases were rampant as a result. So it was an extremely poor standard of living. The European consumption basket started to change only when they obtained forcible access to tropical biodiversity and botanic diversity, because the lands of the global south can produce at least 2 crops in the year. There is all-round cropping. And where you have favorable conditions, where there is enough moisture in the soil or rainfall, you can grow up to 3 crops in the year. These are the delta regions of our countries. In Asia, for example, the Mekong Delta in Vietnam can grow over a period of 4 years, 11 crops over the same piece of land, in the same piece of land, whereas North America or Europe would be able to grow only 3 crops over 4 years. So compare 3 crops over 4 years to 11 crops. So that is one aspect, that even in the case of cereals, our lands are far more productive because we have 2 seasons. In fact, as late as the year 2020, India alone produced more than 300 million tons of grain compared to 286 million produced by 27 countries of the European Union. So add up all the grain production of the entire European Union, and this is before Brexit, that is, not counting also Britain in the European Union, and they produce less grain than we produce in one single country. China produces more grain than the United States produces over the entire year, more than 500 million tons compared, around 600 million tons, taking out potato production from Chinese production, compared to around 500 million tons in the United States. So apart from this, you have to remember that countries in the global south, of which we are a part, including Central America, South American countries, which are tropical, African countries, and Asian countries, produce an enormous range of products and crops which cannot ever be produced in the global north. That is, unlike any other sector of production, crops are climate and soil specific, and they can never substitute, they can never import substitute in these crops. So the list of those crops are given in my book. I don't want to take up time again telling you what those crops are, but you have to look at them, because since we read only the books which come from Northern universities and they don't mention any of this, our own students are completely ignorant about the fact that we are not poor. We are extremely rich in resources. In fact, the northern countries are extremely poor in resources. If the southern global south had not been rich in resources, then they would not have invited the greed of what constitutes today's global north, all right? So they wanted access to our enormous tropical botanic diversity in order to improve and diversify their own consumption basket. However, they had a problem in that countries like India or China or Java or countries in Africa had no reciprocal demand for northern products. There was this famous remark made by the Chinese Emperor Qianlong when King George III of England sent an envoy to the court at Peking asking for trade concessions that they be allowed to, establish a post in China, in Canton, to engage in trade. So the Chinese emperor wrote this letter to George III saying that we don't need any of your products. The Celestial Empire produces everything it needs in great profusion. But since you cannot do without our silk, our porcelain, and our tea, you and other European nations simply cannot do without it. Out of the great beneficence of our, out of our great beneficence, we will allow you to establish a port at Canton. But we don't need your trade. We don't need anything from you. That was true of India as well. I mean, and what could the Javanese possibly import from the Netherlands? What did they need? Nothing. We could produce everything we needed, including the manufactures that we needed. In fact, China was probably the largest exporter of silk fabrics in the world, and India, the largest exporter, definitely the largest exporter of cotton textiles in the world, up to the early 19th century. Okay, before Britain started pouring Lancashire products into our market after closing its own economy to Indian fabrics. So that's a very long story of mercantilism. I don't have time to go into that there, but it is mentioned in our book exactly what kind of mercantilist measures were adopted by Britain to prevent imports of manufactures from the global south into their own economy until they could build up their own capacity for producing cotton textiles. And of course, that was entirely on the basis of imported raw materials. Now, since there was no reciprocal demand of the global south, which was the northern countries, let's come down to Britain specifically instead of in general, but it applied to all other European countries as well. Britain ran a continuous trade deficit vis-a-vis India, which involved an outflow of silver, because gold and silver were the only commodities which were accepted as international money, and together they're called specie. So there was a continuous outflow of silver, which of course attracted the criticism of the mercantilist writers. And this problem was solved once Britain acquired political control after obtaining the right of revenue collection in Bengal after 1765, the Diwani of Bengal from the Mughal emperor, which meant that they became, they were given the right of tax collection, of raising taxes. And that changed the situation completely, because now what they started to do was to use a large part of the taxes that they locally collected to buy their products. So you can imagine a trading company no longer has to make any outlay, not a single penny's worth of outlay of its own on purchasing products and make its profit by selling that product at a higher price, which is normally how traders operate. Did not have to make a single penny's outlay. It simply got the money from the local producers by imposing taxes on them. And it used a large part of that, a quarter to 1/3 of net revenue collections in Bengal were used to simply buy the local produce and send it abroad. And this meant they got the goods completely free. It also created no external liability for Britain at all. Britain had a trade deficit with India, continuing trade deficit, but it didn't matter because it did not have to pay for that trade deficit. The local producers of those goods that it was importing had been already paid out of their own taxes, which meant they were not paid at all. So this is very difficult for people who are brought up on standard Keynesian macroeconomics to get their head around this process. But it's really very simple. It simply requires a modification of what we know as standard macroeconomic accounting, national income accounting, which you derive from the Keynesian system, which we try to explain in terms of a very simple example. Supposing in Bengal, when the company starts collecting taxes, you are somebody who's producing agricultural products, rice and so on, and you are also an artisan producing cloth. So if I'm a producer in Bengal and I sell, what is the example I give? I think, let's say 2 bags of rice and 10 yards of cloth. I sell that to a local trader, okay? I exchange that for money. That's a normal transaction because the trader has to advance his own funds to buy from me. And he does that because he expects to sell the product and make a profit. He expects to sell at a higher price and make a profit, okay? A normal trade. But when the East India Company's agent comes to buy from me, he buys my cloth and my rice, supposing the company has collected 100 rupees tax from me already. And then my cloth and rice is bought by the company agent for 50 rupees. To me, as a producer, it appears as a normal market transaction, no different from my sale to a local trader. The local trader gives me money. The company agent is also giving me money, all right, for my product, for the same amount of product. But it is actually qualitatively completely different because I, the producer, I do not know that the 50 rupees that the company trader is giving me has been collected by another company agent from me as tax. So 50 rupees out of my 100 rupees tax is coming back to me and my product is being taken away. So this is a very unusual transaction in which all that is happening is that half of my total tax payment of 100 rupees, 50 rupees is simply changing its form. It is changing its form from cash to kind. From cash, which is the form in which it was collected, it is changing to 2 yards of cloth and 5 bags of rice, or whatever the example I gave you originally, I don't remember, all right? So actually the company is getting it without making a single penny's outlay of its own. It's getting it free. It's not paying the producer. But the producer thinks that he's being paid because there is a market transaction. So the market transaction can be a very effective means of actually hiding real relationships of exploitation. So the company then was getting these commodities completely free, and this is the essence of the drain of wealth. And we can easily compute that. In fact, long before Indians did it, there was a very acute observer called Montgomery Martin who made a calculation of the drain of wealth. He wrote a book in 1838. He also gave evidence to a select committee appointed by English Parliament to look into this whole question of producers not getting enough money. So he said, it's not just they're not getting enough money. Actually, they're not being paid because there's a tribute that England is imposing on the producers. It is simply converting their taxes into commodities and taking it away. So he made an estimate of the drain, and that estimate was quoted in Ramesh Chandra Dutt, and that is also reproduced in the book. Please have a look at that estimate. All right. And he was absolutely right. England was getting these goods free. Now, the amounts involved were enormous. Okay. For example, if you look at the data, you find that during the raw cotton boom of the 1860s, when there was a civil war in America and raw cotton supplies from the the southern states of the US to Britain, to its factories were cut off. The raw cotton prices rose astronomically, and there was a huge raw cotton boom in the Bombay Deccan. Lakhs of acres of jawar producing land was converted to cotton production. And India exported enormous amounts of raw cotton. In fact, for the 15 years, starting from the mid-1860s, India earned something like more than 150 million pounds as the commodity export surplus, which was a very large sum those days. And if you look at the total outlay that Britain made on railways and irrigation over the same period, it was 26 million pounds. So if India had been allowed to keep even a fraction, even 1/5 of its total commodity export surplus earnings, record earnings, it would have covered the entire outlay on railways and irrigation. But the British, of course, took all of it, okay? They took all of it. By the way, by the time we come to the 1860s, the mechanism is slightly different because company rule has been replaced by direct rule by the government of Britain. India had come directly under the crown, no longer being ruled by the crown. I'll come to the new mechanism in a moment. So having taken away all the record export surplus earnings, then Britain forced India to borrow from the London money market for the railways and irrigation investment. And it guaranteed the rate of return out of the Indian budget to the private investors. So, you know, it was a mode of exploitation which was unthinkably high and which has not been fully documented even to this date. So I'm working on a book in which I hope to use the data all the way from the 1830s to 1938. They are available, but they have not been systematically worked on. I've only presented a little bit of the data in some of the chapters in the book Capital and Imperialism to give you an idea of what was going on. But the entire series is actually available from which we can estimate what the drain of wealth really was. Now, the mechanism that was introduced after the Great Rebellion of 1857 to 59, when you know, the rule over India passed directly to the crown, was very diabolically clever. It was different now because by this time, India had been made to become a market for Lancashire textiles. So there was no longer a direct export surplus to Britain. Indian exports were going all over the world. So the British rulers had to think of some method of getting hold of India's export surplus earnings, which were now going all over the world. It was going to North America, it was going to European continent, which it was doing earlier as well. It was going to China, to Japan, later on also to Latin America. What they thought up was very clever. It was very simple. The second most important portfolio in the British government was that of the Secretary of State for India, who was a minister in the British government and who operated the India office in London. So this minister, the Secretary of State, told foreign importers, and this system starts from 1861, after the Great Rebellion, told foreign importers, you are importing from India, you need to send your money as payment. So whatever you want to send, whether it's gold or dollars or Deutschmarks or francs or whatever it is, and by this time, you know, these countries were moving, by the 1870s, they were moving towards a system of fixed exchange rates under the gold standard. So all these local currencies were convertible at fixed rates to sterling, which was linked to gold. Dollar was also linked to gold at this time. So you can use, you know, dollar, franc, Deutschmarks synonymously with sterling from the 1870s onwards, because there's a fixed system of exchange rates. You know. Now, you deposit what you need to pay to Indian exporters with me. So all the gold and foreign exchange comes to the Secretary of State, from which it goes directly into the British Treasury. The Secretary of State issues a bill of exchange called the Council Bill, because the full title of the Secretary of State was Secretary of State for India in Council. So he issues a bill of an equivalent amount. So if I'm an American importer of Indian goods, and I have bought $1,000 worth of you know, Indian goods, then I deposit my $1,000, which was at that time equivalent to around 220 pounds sterling. I deposit it with the Secretary of State. So he issues me 3,000 rupees worth of claim that I can send to the exporters in India. So this bill goes to the exporters deposit it through the exchange banks, and they are paid 3,000 rupees for their $1,000 worth of, that was the exchange rate at that time. 3 rupees could buy $1, all right? You're looking puzzled about why 3,000 rupees. So the exchange rate was 3 rupees to $1 historically. Actually, yeah, it was even better than that for the period I'm talking about, but let me not get into that. It became around 3 rupees by 1900 or so. So that amount that is paid to the exporter comes out of the Indian budget. Okay. And this is the part of the budget which is designated by the British government as expenditure in England. And this is the part of the Indian budget over which the Secretary of State has a claim. He has a preemptive claim on this part of the Indian budget. So, you know, the exporters are being paid just as before out of the taxes which are raised from the Indian people. So the people who are actually producing the export goods are the people who are paying the taxes. They're being taxed in the form of land revenue and indirect taxes, the tax on salt, the tax, the high price of salt, which was a monopoly of the colonial government, the opium monopoly, land revenue. So the actual producers, the ordinary cultivators and the artisans are the people who are paying the taxes. But they're being paid for their export goods out of the same taxes that they have contributed to the budget. So exactly the same system is continued. The economic essence of the East India Company system continues, except that now you have the intermediation of a particular financial instrument, that is the council bills, which was not there before. Now, the surprising thing is that a simple bill of exchange has caused so much confusion that our economic historians have been completely baffled by it. Because you can get a very clear estimate of the degree of transfer simply by looking at the value of council bills, which measures the commodity export surplus earnings India had, which was completely appropriated by Britain. Okay? And I think part of the reason why our historians have been baffled, and of course the Western historians don't talk about it at all, is because there was deliberate obfuscation. After the Great Rebellion, many economic historians have noted that the British administrators clammed up. There were no longer people like Montgomery Martin who deplored the drain of India. There were no longer administrators like George Wingate who said the worst part of our rule is that we take a tribute from India, because taxes which are raised in one country and spent in another country is very bad for the population of the originating country. He wrote in the 1830s, Wingate, and Ramesh Chandra Dutt quotes him. There were no longer such frank admissions after the Great Rebellion. The British administrators clammed up completely, and they in fact deliberately started misleading people about what the drain consisted in, because they did not want, by now you had the so-called Indian nationalists. Now nationalism is a dirty word in Northern universities. So I prefer to use I think wrongly, I prefer to use the word patriots. So they knew that by the 1860s, 70s, turn of the century, when Keynes was writing, which was in 1913, they knew that the moment these people like Ramesh Dutt, Dadabhai Nauroji and others realized what was happening and they could measure it, they would immediately, in a flash, be on to them and say that, look, you're robbing the population, which of course they were. And they would demand parliamentary inquiries. They would make a nuisance of themselves. That's from the viewpoint of the rulers. And even as far as the bulk of the administrators of British India were concerned, I don't think that the English administrators, they didn't know about the mechanism. You know, it was only a handful of extremely intelligent people who operated the financial mechanism. And Keynes was one of them, because Keynes's first job, very first job he ever held was in the India office in London. At the age of 23, he left when he was 25. The very first book he ever wrote, published in 1913, was Indian Currency and Finance. He used to give lecture courses on Indian currency and finance to university students in Cambridge, not just one or two stray lectures, but entire courses of lectures. And he thought that the Indian financial system was extremely intricate and artificial. And he was right. It was artificial because the whole system was a managed system. It was managed in such a manner that there was a direct linking of the budget with external accounts. And you do not have such a direct linking. In no sovereign country in the world are budgetary resources used for reimbursing the producers of export goods who have themselves contributed taxes to the budget and who are thereby defrauded. So it is really a state-operated system of defrauding the producers, of making them think they're being paid when they're actually not being paid at all, when they're being taxed out of their goods. And the state-operated system was so lucrative for Britain, because Britain, even though it ran enormous trade deficit vis-a-vis North America and continental Europe, was not only able to cover its deficits by using India's increasing export surplus earnings, which it completely appropriated, it went further. It was able also to export capital to those very countries with which it ran trade deficits. Now, as economic students, you will know that the export of capital, unlike the export of goods, is a negative item on a country's balance of payments. So if your country is both running a deficit on its current account and it is exporting capital, it means it is running, you add up the two, it is running a large deficit on its balance of payments vis-a-vis those particular countries, right? So how, I mean, as you know, the balance of payments, overall balance of payments has to balance. So if you're running a deficit on your balance of countries vis-a-vis particular areas of the world, you have to have your surplus with other areas of the world. Britain did not have a surplus vis-a-vis its tropical colonies. But what it had was political control, which enabled it to take over the colonies' entire export surplus earnings. I would say commodity export surplus earnings, because the merchandise export surplus was even larger than the commodity export surplus. The difference is the net import of commodity gold. I don't have time to go into that there. So if you're able to, if you exercise this political control, then you're able to defraud producers by not paying them, take over their entire export surplus earnings. And how you justify it is a matter which comes later. The justification is given by imposing all kinds of administered invisibles on the Indian balance of payments in order to balance India's overall external accounts, all right? But that comes later. The fact you have to remember that the appropriation of India's entire export surplus earnings comes prior to the justification. If there's a question on this, I will answer that later. So our argument really is that neither the Industrial Revolution in Britain nor the diffusion of capitalism to North America and other countries of the global North would have been possible without the exploitation of the tropical colonies. And I'm absolutely certain that Java was being exploited in exactly the same way by the Netherlands through the budget. The inhabitants of Vietnam and other countries of Indochina were being exploited in exactly the same way as in France. But to my knowledge, nobody has looked at this so far. At least in our country, we have 100-year-old literature on this. But for other countries, nobody has looked at how the colonialists use their budgetary budgets. So there's an enormous area of economic history which is waiting to be explored, which nobody has explored before. And a major reason for this, of course, is that we are brought up on the logically incorrect theories on trade and development, which are propagated from Northern universities. So I make it a point to used to make it a point when I still taught in JAU, to tell students that, look, we all have colonized minds because we have been fed theories which are incorrect. So first you have to decolonize the mind to get rid of your wrong theories. And one of the most influential, I would say the most influential theory, of course, has been Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which contains a logical fallacy. It contains a material fallacy which is supported by a logical fallacy. And the material fallacies, well, fallacies can be of different kinds. Material fallacies arise from incorrect statement of fact. Verbal fallacies, which are logical fallacies, because logic comes from the term logos, discourse. So it's very important to use terms correctly. So verbal fallacies, which is logical fallacies, arise from incorrect use of terms, and formal fallacies arise from an incorrect formal process of inference. Now, I wrote a paper way back more than 15 years ago called Ricardo's fallacy, in which I pointed out that Ricardo's theory that specialization according to comparative cost advantage will lead to mutual benefit for the countries engaging in trade contains the converse fallacy of accident, a material fallacy, because you cannot define cost at all. You cannot define comparative cost without defining cost of production. And you cannot define cost of production for tropical goods in cold temperate countries. So as an example, if you take Kenya and Britain, Kenya can produce both tea and cotton cloth. Britain can produce cotton cloth, but not tea. So you can define relative cost of production, the transformation frontier between tea and cotton cloth for Kenya, but you cannot define that for Britain. Because where an output is zero, there is no cost of production. It's not possible. It is undefinable, okay? So this is a material fallacy. And when there is when the assumption both countries produce both goods and comparative costs are definable, that assumption itself is wrong. The conclusion of mutual benefit is wrong. And on the contrary, colonized countries lost out from the trade that they were forced to engage in. And the major way that they lost out is through a decline in their population's standard of living, and is particularly in their nutritional standard. Because the colonizing countries made sure that initially they used force, later on they used only the market mechanism. They made sure that the cropping pattern of the tropical colonies was altered away from the staple foods that the local population required towards the crops which they could not produce, that is the global north could not produce then and cannot produce today. The crops which they required for their carry on their industrial production, and the crops they required as part of their diversified consumption basket. So the induced cropping pattern changes as a result of diverting more and more land and resources in the colonies towards the crops they required. There was a decline in per capita food grains output, which is very well documented for India. Even to this day, Blind's book, as well as Shiva Subramaniam's calculation of national income and so on, tells us that the per capita availability of food grains declined by, according to Blind, by almost 30% for British India between 1900 and 1947. But in Bengal, which had been longest under colonial rule, between the First War and 1947, it declined by much more, by almost 40%, okay? So the nutritional standard of the population went down severely. No matter how productive tropical lands are, they could not possibly feed and meet the requirements, the insatiable requirements of the global north, and at the same time maintain their own output of food grains that they needed for their own populations. Now, theoretically, they could have done so if there had been a huge amount of investment. But of course, the colonizers, the colonizing imperialist powers did not care whether how many people starved to death in colonized India. There were not only recurrent famines, of course, which I've not mentioned at all, particularly in Bengal. British rule in Bengal started with a massive famine in 1769-70, just 5 years after revenue collecting rights were taken over. It ended with another massive famine in 1943-44, which was completely an engineered famine because India was made to bear the cost of Allied forces war spending in South Asia. So apart from the recurrent famine, there was a long-term secular decline in the consumption level of the general population. So that's a huge decline, you know. If you get a decline from around 200 kilograms per capita by 1946, it was down to 137 kilograms per capita. Not even the poorest developing country today, not even the poorest of the least developed countries today had the kind of per capita, low per capita food grains availability that India had on the eve of independence. So this is the inverse relation that I have talked about and written about for the last 20 years. Now, the main impact of recolonization which has been taking place And we have been arguing, and I've been arguing for the last 25 years, since 1991, when neoliberal policies of opening up our economy to global trade started again, and of removing protection to our small producers started again, that this is extremely dangerous, because this was also taking place in an era where you have contractionary fiscal policies, where the new mantra under neoliberalism was that the state had to cut back on development expenditures, on social sector expenditures. And obviously, if the state is cutting back on development expenditures, then you cannot possibly maintain, because the state expenditure is very important for keeping up even private investment in agriculture. If the state is cutting back, then you cannot maintain the rate of growth of your agricultural output, and in particular food grains output. And once again, you would see, I predicted in 1992 in a paper I wrote for an ILO and a conference co-organized by women's organizations in India in 1992, that we were going to see an economic recolonization of India taking place, in which, again, once more, the per capita food grains output would start declining. You see, in the 40 years between independence and 1990, our per capita food grains availability had slowly climbed from the low of 137 kilograms. It has slowly climbed to 180 kilograms by the 3-year periods centered on 1990. Because at that time, we had protected our small producers. We had, under the Nehruvian dirigist regime, cordoned off to some extent through quantitative restrictions and tariffs and so on, cordoned off our economy from the inequalizing pull of the global market. We had privileged food security for our own population. That is, nothing was to be exported until the local population's needs for food and raw materials were satisfied. So you had a slow regaining. We were still below the 1900 level of 200 kilograms, but at least we were back to around 180 kilograms. Now, after neoliberal policies of trade openness and fiscal contraction were introduced, we plunged back from 180 kilograms to 160 kilograms per capita in the 3-year period centered on 2008, when you had that global price spike. And because of the global price spike, there was a slight rolling back of the misguided policies that had been followed under neoliberalism. You had a slight improvement, but even to this day, our per capita food grains availability is much lower than it was in 1990 to 93, before the neoliberal policies began. So this is the big danger of economic recolonization. So this is I see as the gravest problem. And this has been, of course, I'll wind up in a couple of minutes. I think I've already taken about 50 minutes or so. This is accompanied by a false estimate of poverty coming from the World Bank, coming from every government in the world, which have claimed, most governments in the world, and of course the World Bank has been claiming, that there's been a substantial decline of poverty, which is completely false, because just as there's a fallacy in Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, there is a fallacy underlying the method that our Planning Commission has used for the best part of 50 years, which every government in the world has used, which the Chinese government is also using today, with the blessings of the World Bank, which the World Bank is using. There's a fallacy in the method of calculating poverty, because what they have done is to abandon the original definition of poverty completely. It is no longer linked to any kind of nutrition norm. They have changed the definition halfway, and they are now only price indexing an original poverty line, which had been obtained on the basis of a nutrition norm, but they've been price indexing it for the last 50 years. And price indexation has meant that at the official poverty line, the population is getting lower and lower calorie and protein intake. That is the standard against which poverty is supposed to be measured. It has itself been lowered over time. So it is an academically and logically inadmissible method of computation. I'm in the process of finalizing a book on the problems of official and World Bank poverty estimation, which should have been out by now, but thanks to the pandemic, it is greatly delayed, as was our book, Capital and Imperialism. It was delayed by almost 1 year. So hopefully, I can expand on this argument, because I have looked at the consumption, expenditure, and the nutritional intake data for India right from 1973 to, I won't say the latest estimates for 2017-18, but as you know, the situation, even with regard to price indexed poverty lines was so bad by 2017-18 that the government has withdrawn. The present government has not allowed that to be put in the public domain. The NSS survey for 2017-18 has not been put in the public domain, okay? Because even according to the official and incorrect method of calculation, the situation is very bad. And you are also familiar with the fact that owing even before the pandemic, because of demonetization and artificial recession was introduced into the Indian economy. So that too has raised poverty enormously. It has led to a decline in the consumption level of the general population. And the pandemic, of course, has been the last straw. At present, I would estimate that at least, this is the estimate for 2009-10, which was a drought year. And I would estimate that at least 75% of our rural and urban population cannot access the official nutrition norms of 2,100 calories in urban areas and 2,200 calories in rural areas. 2,200, not 2,400, because in practice, 2,200 is the level of nutritional intake which had been applied way back in 1973 itself, not 2,400. So what I would say that for the last 25 years, we have been seeing a process of economic recolonization, because the global North has again been telling us, and it has succeeded with most other countries, open up to free trade, which means alter your cropping pattern in such a manner that we get the commodities we need to fill our supermarket shelves. And if you need food grains, buy from us. So that has really been the challenge. And that links up with what has been happening at the WTO, the continuous attack on food security, public stocking of food grains and food security systems of the global North that has been mounted through the WTO by the advanced capitalist countries. So let me stop there, because I think I've spoken for long enough. And if there are questions and so on, maybe some points I can expand upon.
Yes, ma'am, there are a few questions in the chat box. So first one is from Aishwarya. Ma'am, you talked about the 1870s fixed exchange rate system. We have mostly known about the gold exchange rate system after Bretton Woods originated, that is from 1944 till around 1980s, when the system was shifted from gold exchange to $1. What was the mechanism before the Bretton Woods came into existence, and how was it decided? Ma'am, you need to unmute yourself.
Let me collect 2 or 3 questions and then, go into
the next question is, why was it the case that the Europeans didn't settle in countries with rich resources but relatively dense population, like the Spanish people in Chile or Britishers in India, and chose to settle in countries that was not rich in natural resources, where they actually have to put more effort to get themselves settled? Is it because is it because they could create institutions or ideologies easily in those countries? And the next question is, does imperialism exist in the post-colonial world? If it does, what shape and form does it take?
Okay. I think those questions, okay, just excuse me for a moment. I can't read here. I'll put the big light on. Yeah, with regard to the first question, the gold standard was a standard of a system of fixed exchange rates that all European countries and the United States moved towards from the 1870s, and it lasted until the Great Depression. Britain went off the gold standard in 1931, all right? So it lasted for like the best part of at least 50 years, all right? And you should certainly read about the gold standard, which prevailed in the late 19th century, because that was the period of high imperialism, when whatever remained unoccupied by the European and North American powers, the new industrializers, whatever parts of the world remained unoccupied, there was a new thrust of conquering and occupying those parts of the world, particularly on the part of the United States, Germany, Italy, Japan. But even Britain expanded its colonial possessions enormously under this period of the gold standard. And I would ask you to begin by reading the article I have published in the latest issue of Social Scientist. That is the, I think it's the September-October issue of Social Scientist, which should be there on the stands now, which is called Imperialism, Gold Standard, and the Colonized. Okay, because that specifically tells you very briefly about the 19th century to 1931 gold standard and the relationship of that to imperialism. That is, gold standard of fixed, under the gold standard, when you have fixed exchange rates, a country, European country, or the USA, if it faced any kind of external imbalance or balance of payments difficulties, could not actually rectify it by devaluing its currency, okay? Because they were all on a fixed standard, right? But they had no problem at all. Even if they had deficits on their balance of payments, on their current account, or even on their balance of payments, they could continue adhering to a system of fixed exchange rates only because they had access to the enormous foreign exchange and gold earnings of the tropical colonized world. Okay, now think of it this way. And that continues, to this day in some form or the other. Because even though there is not formal colonial control, there is, as it were, continuous badgering of the developing countries who are told that you have to build up your foreign exchange reserves. Your reserves are not large enough. The IMF is telling them that, the international financial institutions are telling them that. So they're made to build up reserves which are far out of sync with what they require. If you just look at India's current account deficit, it does not really justify the kind of very large capital inflow, the kind of large borrowing we have done from the world. But you are brainwashed into thinking that you need foreign capital, you need to borrow. But ultimately, what does it amount to? It amounts to a country like India borrowing short, borrowing at high interest rates from the world. And then in order that its currency does not appreciate, it then lends long. It holds these borrowings in the form of securities, US government securities, which give a very low yield. So you're borrowing short at a high rate of interest from the world, and you're lending to the world capitalist leader at a very low rate of interest. Now, if you're an individual, you would be mad to do that. You would not borrow, at a 12% rate of interest and then lend to somebody else at a 5% rate of interest. It involves a loss for you. So there are modern forms of the drain, but our governments are brainwashed, and they are done that there's a very, very, very kind of, sleazy operation which goes on, in which intellectuals are picked up, promising bright intellectuals are picked up from the developing world. Then they're trained in international financial institutions and the very right-wing universities with right-wing economics departments like Harvard and Princeton and so on, or they're trained by the IMF. And then they're repositioned in strategic positions in commerce ministries and finance ministries in the developing world. Now, all this has been documented quite a lot. So you have to read the literature, and you would not believe the amount of thought, thinking, and manipulation which goes into this. So it is actually our Ghar Shatru Vibhishana, if I may say so. Since I'm talking to an Indian audience, there is a term, Ghar Shatru Vibhishana. It is our Ghar Shatru Vibhishanas. It's not the foreigners who are telling us to do all these silly things. It is our own economists who have been ideologically, as it were, completely subverted, and of course also rewarded very generously in many ways, so that developing countries follow the kind of financial policies of opening up and letting foreign capital in at high interest rates, which benefits the advanced capitalist world. So again, to end up with my answer to this question, please do read my paper and then go on to a Google search on the International Gold Standard, known as the International Gold Standard. It began in the late 19th century. You definitely have to read about that if you want to understand anything about the fixed exchange rate regime immediately after the war under the Bretton Woods system, okay? You have to have some kind of scholarly depth to your understanding. Not enough to read about the current economy, current economic developments if you don't know anything about your own economic history. Why didn't the colonizers settle in the countries which had rich natural resources? Well, first of all, the climate was not conducive for them. They were used to a cold climate. Secondly, they could not actually physically take over tropical land. These tropical lands were already occupied and densely occupied by peasant populations. Whether you have Netherlands in Java or the French in Indochina, these were very ancient civilizations, or the Chinese civilization, the Indian civilization. They go back to like, at least 4,000 years. And these are not, as it were, tribal populations who can be simply massacred. Even in Central America, you had ancient civilizations, very complex systems, but these were relatively small areas. And what the Spaniards and the Portuguese did in Spain and Latin, and what came to be known as in Central America and Southern America was horrendous. It was actually genocide, It was completely physically massacring local populations in order to grab their land resources. But that is something which was really difficult to do after a point of time with densely populated tropical areas like southern China. Northern China, by the way, was occupied by Japan for a considerable length of time. Manchuria was occupied. But the whole of central and southern China was densely populated. So was Indochina, so was India, most of Asia. You see, so there's a question of feasibility. Think of the size of Britain as a colonizing country. When it started ruling, got the revenue collecting right in Bengal, and from there expanded to the rest of India, Britain's population in around 1770 was nothing. It was like, 7 million people. The population of Bengal province alone was 4 times that. So there's a question of feasibility. Similarly, the immigrants who went to North America did get rich resources. After all, North America is of continental proportion. It stretches all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. So you have 3,000 miles of territory. And you're not just talking about agricultural products. You're talking about the timber resources, the mineral resources, the fossil fuel resources, the water resources of this enormous region, which you have occupied forcibly by massacring the local population and putting the rest into reservation, which is also what they did in South Africa. In South Africa, of course, the Dutch did it first, and the British in the Boer Wars displaced the Dutch to grab the land resources of South Africa. And effectively, it is still colonized, even though it's politically free, because they ensured that the richest land resources remained with a tiny white minority there. So, why should they actually settle in any large numbers in Asian countries when they could use their position of conquest and control over the local budget simply to fleece the population, to simply take all their goods away free? If it was possible for them to do so, they would have physically shifted tropical land to temperate areas, but it's not possible, fortunately. Joan Robinson, whose graduate seminar I used to attend when I was a doctoral student in Cambridge, told us that the worst thing you can have is non-renewable resources being taken away by the colonizers. That is mineral resources, because you have a limited amount of it. Once you've taken out all the gold and diamonds and rubies from Burma, there's very little left. And it's not going to be replenishable. You know, these are not renewable resources. Or you take out the coal and the fossil fuels from our country, from Saudi Arabia, you take it away from Nigeria or elsewhere. Then these are non-renewable resources. But land, at least, once the colonizers are booted out, land can then be redirected. The use of the land can be redirected to satisfy the needs of your own population, rather than filling the supermarket shelves in the industrial north. And the populations of the industrial north are so used to a highly diversified consumption basket that they do not even think that they are completely import dependent on the countries of the global south. This is never told to them in any of their books, in any of the courses they attend. They are simply unaware of it. You have to point it out to them that, look, if today the supermarket shelves in Germany or Britain, Norway, Sweden, Canada, USA, if they became completely empty of tropical goods, then your standard of life would plunge to a level which would be only slightly better than that which prevailed during the medieval age. You would have enough grain, you would have enough dairy products, and you would have enough meat, which is part of course, animal products, but you would have no fresh vegetables or fruit in winter at all, okay? And you would not even have the vegetables and fruit you can produce in summer in your winter months, because you cannot grow anything in the winter months. So, you know, you have to realize, we have to realize that the demands of the global north today on the countries of the global south, including India, are even greater today than they were during the period of colonial rule. Why? Because at least during that period, you know, ships had to go through the Suez Canal from Bombay to England, took 3 weeks at least. I made the journey myself as a child when my father who was a government servant, was posted in the mid-1950s to London. So, and if you go around the Cape of Good Hope, it will take even longer, much, much longer, all right? So before 1869, everything had to come around the Cape, 14,000 nautical miles, even greater to get to China. Even after the Suez Canal, it takes 3 weeks. So they could only import non-perishable goods from us. Today, with the cheapening of air freight, in a matter of 15 hours, fresh produce, fish, flowers, fruit, vegetables can be flown in January. We are now in January, right? When everything is frozen in North America or in Europe. In 15 hours, they can transport produce from our countries to Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and of course, in a shorter time to Berlin, Bonn, Paris, London. And from North America or North Africa or Central Africa, East and West Africa, in a matter of 5 or 6 hours, or even less. So air freighting means that we have a new round of demands on us, on our primary sector. Nobody understands this because it's never talked about, but it is true. And that is why the farmer struggle, which has just ended, the year-long farmer struggle in our country, has been so important, because most people don't realize that it has been an anti-imperialist struggle. It is not just a struggle of the farmers alone for maintaining the system of minimum support prices. The system of minimum support prices is absolutely crucial to the maintenance of some modicum of food security for our poor populations, because with all its drawbacks, with all its problems, our system of public procurement and distribution is still providing some minimal food security to our poor population, which has got further impoverished over the last 25 years. which was historically pushed down to a subhuman level, and which has lost most of the gains that had been made between 1950 and 1990, and has been again pushed down to a very low standard of life. So that system has to be preserved. And that is a system that North America, Canada, Australia, the European Union wish to destroy. They have been attacking public procurement and distribution of food grains in all developing countries for the last 25 years. And even 3 years ago, the United States complained against India to the World Trade Organization, giving completely false estimates that it is exceeding the 10%, exceeding the 10% limit of market price support it is supposed to give, maximum it is supposed to give to its farmers. It made spurious calculations. And just now, India has lost sugar subsidy struggle vis-a-vis Brazil and Australia. Unfortunately, even developing countries are being pitted against each other by the World Trade Organization, again on the basis of spurious calculations. So the whole WTO regime, again, is something which will require another 1 hour of lectures for people to understand that the agreement on agriculture is one of the most dishonest documents in the world. It embodies complete bad faith. It embodies the attempt of the advanced countries to actually once again fleece the developing countries and to fool them into giving their products virtually free. Okay, third question. My handwriting is so poor that I've forgotten, I can't even read what the third question is. Could you please remind me what it was?
Yes, ma'am, I'm repeating the question. Does imperialism exist in the post-colonial world? If it does, what shape and form does it take?
I think I've already answered that. There were two aspects to old imperialism, which in fact, the well-intentioned scholars mainly focus on the question of markets. For example, in the Marxist literature, there's this brilliant book of Rosa Luxemburg's, The Accumulation of Capital, in which Luxemburg points out that there is a logical contradiction in talking about a closed capitalist economy. And a capitalist system requires external markets. So it needs to all the time destroy the peasant sector within the national boundaries, which it has already done in Europe and in North America. But then it goes outside its national boundaries to the global south, what we call the global south, to destroy the peasant sector there. So capitalism requires constantly markets outside. But what is missing even though Luxemburg's book was so brilliant, is the fact that even, of course, the acquisition of markets is absolutely essential for capitalism to expand. It cannot get the markets it wants within its own limits, within the industrial north itself. But at the same time, the access to resources is equally important. In fact, as we have argued, industrial capitalism itself would not have developed without access to imported goods. Okay? And it is this resource dependence which is missing. It is even missing from the Marxist literature. Why? Because the stalwarts of the Marxist literature are people who actually read mainly what the colonial administrators themselves wrote about their colonies. And that was a very biased account. And none of them had actually physically ever visited a country in the global south. None of the literature they read ever talked about the richness of tropical biodiversity. Yes, the scientists talk about it. Today, the environmentalists talk about it. The botanists talk about it, but not the economists. Even to this day, the logically incorrect theory of comparative advantage is propagated not only in northern universities, our own students are taught this logically incorrect theory. And it doesn't give me any pleasure to say that there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty. There's a lot of fudging of the argument, even on the part of very well-known economists. You think that they have not seen the problem in Ricardo's theory? They have seen it. They have noted this problem. For example, there is an article by Paul Samuelson, which I would ask you to read since you're economics students. It is called Market Mechanisms and maximization. All right. Market mechanisms and yes, did you want to say something? Anybody want?
Ma'am, we have 5 minutes
Ma'am,
left.
it might end abruptly. You can finish the name of the reading that you were taking, ma'am, but we were just informing that the meeting might end in abruptly at 7 p.m.
Yeah, can you tell people whose questions I am not able to answer online that they can send the questions if they want me to respond. They can send it by email. You have my email ID. You can send it on to me. So I will give some brief responses. If they
And ma'am, one of the questions is by another professor who is Emeritus Professor of Oxford. So ma'am, if you can address it in the time left.
No, I don't distinguish between important people and students. So you kindly ask the Emeritus Professor, and I'm sure he or she would not mind at all, to send the question, or you write down the question.
Ma'am, it's the following question. So, I mean.
Oh, Barbara Harris. I know Barbara very well. I know Barbara well. I can communicate with her by email. All right. And she says, I don't mind at all. Okay. Barbara I've known since we were fellow students in Oxford. And that is more than 50 years ago. Okay. So, and I would advise you not to privilege faculty members over students. Students need to hear about it more. All right. So I was talking about the fact that Paul Samuelson actually has an article which I would request you to read. It's called Market Mechanisms and Maximization. All right. Market Mechanisms and Maximization. And it is available in the collected scientific papers of Paul Samuelson. Okay. And Samuelson is discussing Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage specifically. But without telling you why he does so, he changes the example. Instead of wine and cloth, of Ricardo's famous example, he puts in the diagram as well as in the text, food and cloth. Why does he do that? Very simple, because the example Ricardo gave did not fit his own assumption. Britain could not produce commercially enough grapes for producing grape wine. They could produce it individually, but not on a commercial basis. So he alters the example, but you would expect a Nobel laureate, a senior economist, to at least be honest with the people who are reading him. At least tell them why you're altering the example. And anyway, why should he arrogate to himself the right to alter Ricardo's example? Can you still hear me? Those who are taking the questions? Hello? No?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
We can still hear you. I guess Professor's mail internet is failing.
She is here again. Her video is off.
Ma'am, please unmute yourself. Professor, you're on mute.
Ma'am, you're muted. And
we are trying to contact Professor Patnaik. In the meantime, I thank all the participants for joining in. Just give us a few moments. We are trying to check if we can get her back.
Hello, should I leave the meeting? Hello.
Yes, ma'am,
Yes,
you're
ma'am.
audible.
Should I leave the meeting now?
No, ma'am, we do have some time. I think the meeting did not really end, so I think we can continue if that's all right.
For like
with
10
the participants.
I think I'm not able to connect anymore.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you very much for this session. We would like to have you another time for another session. If we can arrange for some time from your busy schedule. Thank you so much.
Sure,
And we have
okay.
asked the participants. We are going to share
Yeah.
the questions. So try, if you can, we are going to deliver them the answers as well. We're going to forward.
Okay, okay, fine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.